from Kansas State University. This is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you. And coming up today, K-State's J.P. Michaud will talk about the prospects of sugarcane aphid problems in Kansas grain sorghum this year. He'll go over the signs of SCA activity that you should be watching for. Although indications are, says J.P., that its threat may be minimal this year. Also, we'll lift more highlights from the weekly podcast out of the Beef Cattle Institute here at K-State. This time, Dustin Pendell, Bob Larson, and Brad White will talk about diagnosing lameness in grass cattle, as well as the merits of implanting spring-born calves. Further ahead, K-State's Charlie Lee looks at a new evaluation of raccoon eviction products. All that and more right here on Agriculture Today.
Did you know every Kansas farmer feeds 128-plus people?
Kansas farmers are hard workers, dependable, authentic, and sensitive.
Not only do farmers put food on your table, but they put clothes on your back and fuel in your car.
For more information about Kansas farmers, visit K-State Research and Extension online or stop by your local Extension office. This message has been brought to you by the K-State Animal Sciences Leadership Academy participants.
You're listening to Agriculture Today. You grain sorghum producers are keeping an eye out, hopefully, for a pest which debuted in the state of Kansas just a few years back, the sugarcane aphid. We have an update on that pest now. J.P. Michaud is a research entomologist at K-State's Agricultural Research Center at Hayes, and he and the team of entomologists at K-State are on top of the sugarcane aphid, which did come into Kansas and cause some real headaches early on. J.P., just remind us of the chronology of this pest, if you would.
Well, it probably entered Mexico 2012, early 2013, and made its first appearance north of the border in the Rio Grande Valley in the winter of 2013. In the subsequent years, it became very problematic. Of course, I think the two worst years for us here in Kansas were 2015 and 2016. And last year, of course, problems receded significantly, and there was a lot less sorghum planted, which may have contributed a little bit. But what we see now is that the aphid is well under control, a natural biological control in its overwintering range in Mexico. So that is really significant. We just don't have the large numbers of winged aphids flying around or being produced down south to blow up here that we had in those early years. So aphid invasions, when you have a new aphid, it has three stages. The invasion, the epidemic stage, you have these massive populations doing a lot of damage because the ecology of the other insects, it just isn't prepared for it. Mm-hmm. But of course, evolution is a wonderful thing, and insects evolve that can utilize it, and so we get to the attenuation stage where we are now, which is the problems are becoming more limited in scope, fewer fields affected, and fewer fields reaching threshold, and the infestation is becoming more and more limited spatially as well. And so finally, we're going to get to that point of endemic populations, the third stage, where there's always a few around, but we never really have to worry about it, which is basically the stage we're at with all the other aphids out there. And there's over a dozen species of aphids under natural control in all our field crops. So we're almost there with sugarcane aphid, I think.
But not quite there, and that's why we continue to talk about it, keep producers alert to it.
Yes, well, that is true. And so that you could be in the unfortunate position of being one of those people who do have an outbreak. There's still the possibility of that. There's still caution, and people are advised to keep an eye on things and monitor carefully. I'm especially concerned about a lot of the sorghum that was planted very late this year because we had some very rainy weather in June, and some people really just couldn't get out and plant, I think, as early as they wanted to. And those fields, and I went on a tour just on Wednesday of south central Kansas, we have some sorghum that's already flowering and other sorghum that's only 6 to 10 inches high coming, So that's late planted sorghum. That's going to remain vulnerable for quite a few weeks, right up until, we start getting hardened grain. So that's the sorghum that I would be worried about as being especially vulnerable because the first aphids were only just discovered at the end of last week in Cowley County, South Kansas.
It has been confirmed in that far south central Kansas county. Just a quick reminder of the appearance of this aphid and the damage it inflicts, in case there's a grower out there yet to encounter it.
Well, you can see good pictures on our site. If you go to the entomology extension website under sorghum pests, you'll see lots of good pictures. They're very pale in color when they're small. They get yellow as they grow. They're a yellow aphid, not to be confused with the yellow sugarcane aphid, which is quite different in appearance. It's quite bristly and hairy. But these ones are a very high reproductive rate on susceptible sorghums, and they produce a lot of honeydew. So often when you're driving by a badly infested field, you'll see the leaves just glistening with honeydew. It's not hard to detect. We do have some good resources online for you to help you identify it.
If one does run across sugarcane aphid in their sorghum, at what point does their presence suggest some sort of treatment, JP? The thresholds have been studied fairly closely.
Yes, well, we've got two thresholds now. We've got a threshold for plants in vegetative stage, which is 20% of those plants with established colonies. Now, an established aphid colony would be 50 to 125 aphids on a leaf. And, it doesn't take much to get 100 aphids. 100 aphids it could be a patch of aphids the size of a silver dollar or even a 50-cent piece. So if you've got 20% of your plants, then you're supposed to go to 10 spots in the field, at least 40 to 50 paces apart, and then check 2 leaves on each of 5 plants at each of those spots. And so if you do that 20%, 1 in 5 plants with established colonies or more, then you have a problem that probably requires treatment. Now, once you're heading out, we increase it to 30% of plants infested with the same numbers of aphids. Because the further along the plant gets, the more likely it is able to fill seed before those aphids reach populations that will really affect yield.
And obviously, if you're even further along, you get closer to, say, the black layer stage, you're probably out of harm's way. Right?
Well, this is it. And we do get, the aphids can survive on the plant for quite all the way through, the hardening of the grain and everything. And the only problem they're late is that if there's enough honeydew, it can make it pretty sticky and cause some harvesting problems. But a good rain can take care of that. And then you get wind and dust can also reduce the stickiness. The honeydew will weather off. So sometimes you can just wait that out. Just delay your harvest a bit and then until it's not so sticky. But basically, once you see black layer, then you're not going to lose any more yield.
And as far as sampling, making the count, one wants to be somewhat consistent with this. Once a week for a time?
That's not enough. If you find any aphids at all, you should be going in every 3 days, because that's how quickly they can get out of control in warm weather. Now, that said, we've had really good natural control last year. If you look at the map from last year, all those counties where you see, it was only in the far southwest Kansas that we had any fields at reaching threshold. So those maps, those green shaded counties, and certainly some of the ones I put on the map, there was only one little patch of aphids on one leaf. So that, it was definitely, just because all of those counties were shaded, most of them did not have damaging levels. That was just where the aphid was detected. So there were very few around central Kansas last year. Very, very few. And lots of natural enemies out there in the fields, as if they were almost waiting for them to show up.
Which is a plus.
Well, this is what's really going to save us in the long term, is the beneficial insects. And the good news is, again, that, if you can use transform, Savanto is going to give you a little more residual control. So if it was me and I had an infestation at early stages of plant growth that I had to treat, I would choose the Savanto. Whereas if I was getting close to where the crop was out of danger, then I would use the Transform, because it's going to be a little less expensive. Even if it doesn't last as long, it's also easier on the beneficial insects. So both of these materials are relatively compatible with beneficial insects, and so that's really helped us, because what happens is you spray, you don't kill all the insects necessarily, even with a good application, but if your natural enemies survive, they'll kind of continue and finish up the job for you.
In either treatment case, though, one needs to jump on that treatment as soon as possible before the aphids get out of hand.
Exactly. Right? And so, yes, if you need to treat, you need to treat immediately. That's certainly the case, because in warm weather, these populations can double in every 2 to 3 days. I mean, that's what the reproductive rate is like. But again, there's a lot of acreage in varieties that have different levels of resistance to sugarcane aphids, so that's going to help slow down the production of aphids to the south. And again, the management, people have been more aware, more alert down south, and so again, this thing moves north with planting date. And so the better management has come into play down south. We certainly know that the problems have been much more limited this year in South Texas, and it is up in Oklahoma now, but again, a lot of the counties where it's been detected, it's not necessarily at levels that require treatment.
There's a load of information on sugarcane aphid and other crop insect concerns as well on a site called My Fields, and we might leave folks with information about that resource, JP.
Yes, this is really your go-to place to find out what's happening right now and where. And if the aphid's being detected in your particular area, and we encourage your participation, you can get alerts if you sign up for an account. That's what we want people to do. If you find something you suspect is an aphid, you can upload a photo, and it'll get confirmed by an entomologist who knows what they look like, and then that information will be conveyed in real time to everyone. It's also important for us as researchers because that's how we're tracking the movement of the aphid northward every season, and that data is going to be helpful for us as we produce a synoptic model of just how fast the aphid moves from south to north every year.
It's an excellent service, and you can access it out of the Department of Entomology at K-State. Simply myfields, all one word, .info, myfields.info. Once more, largely a positive story here about sugarcane aphids. Let's keep it that way. And JP, we thank you for the background and the update.
My pleasure as always, Eric.
That's J.P. Michaud, research entomologist for K-State at the university's Agricultural Research Center at Hayes. Once again, the sugarcane aphid still on the minds of grain sorghum producers as a primary pest, but hopefully on its way to the back burner, if you will, over time. You're listening to Agriculture Today, and we'll be back shortly. Agricultural producers, landowners, and creditors, you have a partner in your legal and financial needs. Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services offers reliable, trusted information and guidance. Whether you need advice for ag credit concerns or are transitioning your operation to the next owner, Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services can assist you in making sound decisions for your business. To learn more, call 800-321-3276 or visit us online. Next up on Agriculture Today, some of the highlights from the latest installment of the weekly podcast from the Beef Cattle Institute here at K-State. They call it the BCI Cattle Chat, where the members of the BCI team get together and talk about current topics in the cattle industry. At the microphones this week, livestock economist Dustin Pendell and veterinarians Bob Larson, and leading things off, Brad White.
Today, we're going to talk about a couple different topics. We're going to talk about trade. The other thing, we'll address a couple questions that we've received. One on lameness, looking at how we handle that. And then talking about what do we do in the summer, implanting on cow-calf herds. What are our options there and where are the potential benefits? So, Dustin, you want to jump off? We want to start talking about trade?
Let's talk about trade. Trade has been in the news a lot recently, and we're not necessarily going to get into those details or issues. But I just pulled some statistics from a few different websites, and want to test your knowledge.
Okay.
I think we've been doing this for the last couple of weeks, testing your guys' knowledge, and I think it's
kind of humbling.
It's so. Let's just start. So the beef exports. So we're 2017 numbers. Mm-hmm. Just total beef exports across the world. Name the top 4 or 5 largest beef exporters.
Exporters?
Exporters.
All right.
Countries that
export beef in 2017.
I'm going to guess the United States.
You're talking about the countries that export the most?
Yes.
Australia's number 1.
Name the top.
Maybe as
How about
percent?
the top 3? How about we just do the top 3?
Right. United States, Brazil, Australia.
No, Australia, Brazil, and Canada.
Now, you're thinking of percentage of their market. I'm thinking total tons.
I guess I was thinking of 100% who exports the most in percentage terms.
100% of the beef.
So the way
so 100% of the beef.
Oh, then I am going to drop the United States down. So
what's the answer?
So the largest would be Brazil,
Okay.
17%. And then India is right there, close second at 17%.
Neither of us had India listed.
Australia would be at 15%. U.S. comes in fourth at 14%, followed by the EU and New Zealand.
I would have thought Canada exports a higher percentage of their beef production than we do, but
they do. I mean, they export, 50-60% of their production.
Okay.
But it's a smaller production than some of the others.
Yeah.
All right.
So same question, but now on importers. Who are the top beef importers in the world? Not necessarily just from the U.S. perspective, but they just import beef.
Okay.
Just give me the top, 3 maybe?
So does the EU count as one?
We would count it, EU would be a country.
Okay. So I'll go EU as one of the
Japan,
countries.
maybe? I'd go with Japan. Or
China.
Nah, that's just trendy. So I'd say... And, the other one I'm going to say is the United States. No.
You could say it.
Well, because I'm thinking cattle, not just beef, though. So because of the feeder calves we get in from others. So, all right. So you shamed me into... all right, so I'll go Korea and Japan from Asia, and then EU. I like that.
Okay.
We'll see how that goes.
And who were your 3 again? Right.
EU, China, and Japan. I'll steal one of yours.
Okay, so the top 3 beef importers in 2017, the Greater China region, which includes Vietnam, Hong Kong.
Okay.
Yep.
United States, 15%, and then Japan is number 3.
So I shouldn't have backed off of there.
I shouldn't have backed off.
So, all right.
So now...
But the implications there, for the U.S., we domestically use about 85% of our beef production and about 15%.
Yeah, I want to say 10
exported?
to 12% of our U.S. production is exported.
Is exported, 10 to 12%. Okay.
So that follow-up question to that is, who are our major export markets from the United States? Just give me the top 3 in 2017.
I would guess our North American border countries of Canada and Mexico would be on my top 2. And then Korea.
I'd say Greater China region, the same as last one, and EU.
So the data, and I pulled this data from the LMIC Livestock Market Information Center, but in 2017, it looks like our number 1 export markets for carcass weights would have been Japan, followed by Korea, then Mexico and Canada.
Okay.
That's
there you
interesting.
Go. So
So
those Asian, basically you got some of those Asian markets and our North American markets are really driving a lot of our export.
And one of the things I think to consider when we talk about imports and exports, and we talk about percent, you're talking about percent of production, but it's not necessarily individual animals.
Yeah.
It may be parts of multiple carcasses that are going over.
So yeah, it depends on, we ship livers maybe to the Middle East and certain cuts to, I know tongues maybe, for example, go to Japan, I think. And so
to talk about the export market, if you say, well, that maybe doesn't affect me, it actually could, because it affects a lot of people across the industry.
It affects everybody because it raises the value of a carcass, right, of an animal, and thus it's built into that price that you receive. So it does impact everybody. And so when we hear about these tariffs that are going on, or the discussion in trade, it impacts everybody.
Well,
not just the producers, consumers also.
So let's just say that I got more right than Dr. White did.
We can say that, and I want to end,
but that wouldn't be correct. So hopefully the listeners knew some of those answers, because it's interesting looking at where those export markets are coming from. One question that Bob and I received this week was asking a question about lameness in calves. So calves that have been out on pasture, and these can be either. We'll see this in. Sometimes calves on the cow, but most time in stocker calves. So stocker calves have been out. You'll see some lameness. One of the questions that we had this week was calves grazing fescue, and easy to make the assumption, well, maybe the fescue had a part of that with the heat. What should you do if you see a lame calf? What are your first responses? And if you see multiples, how do we evaluate that? How do we work through that problem?
As inconvenient as it might be, I think it's really important that you actually get the cattle in and look at the feet, because it's easy for me to also fall into the trap of calves on fescue grass, which can have a toxin in the grass that can cause some foot problems, to just assume that if they're eating fescue that must be the cause, or to assume that it's foot rot or one of the other common causes of lameness. But actually, I have found that if I make too many assumptions, I will be wrong. uncomfortable a number of times. And so the best way to prevent being wrong about a lameness issue is actually to get the calves in a chute, look at the feet, and look, see what it can be. It can be a foreign body. It can be, so you can have cuts, abrasions. You can actually find a nail or a wire in the foot that needs to be removed. It might be fescue toxicosis. It might be foot rot, and then you can treat those appropriately. And a lot of times these calves are out on a fairly large pasture. It's not convenient to get them in, but if you're really going to diagnose it and treat it appropriately, going to have to go to the work probably really catching them and looking closely.
You need to catch them, take a look, because sometimes they'll have something in that foot that needs to come out, or there may be something that, as you identify what method to treat them. So, right. I think taking a look at those feet is critical. And if you're seeing multiple animals that are lame, there's something going on. There's some causative factor that we want to be sure that we get them up and try to solve that.
Yes. Sometimes it's just they're out on rough terrain, and it might be some, a musculoskeletal thing that there's not a lot of treatments for, but a lot of times it is something that we can treat. Foot rot, we treat with antibiotics. Fescue, we can treat with a number of ways of getting them off of that grass. And so, if you're going to get the right treatment, you got to get the right diagnosis.
And a lot of those lameness start in the feet. So they may be higher up, but a lot of those...
They do. I mean, occasionally you'll find some cattle with lesions up in the knees or hocks or something like that, but I don't know, 9 times out of 10 or more, it's actually down low in the foot.
The other question that we'll sometimes get in the summer, and we talk about, should I implant my calves? So as a cow-calf operation, and we're running the calves through, and we may be vaccinating them or thinking about other activities to do at 60 days of age or so they're a little bit older. Should we implant them at that time, or what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, and basically there are a number of products that are available to implant suckling calves that do a nice job of adding some additional weight that more than pay for the implant. In fact, it's one of the more cost-effective things we can do to put weight on calves. So in general, I really like to do that. There are times when we don't. So if someone has a contract to be in a natural market or something like that, then they're not going to use implants. But if you're going to be selling your calves through a more traditional market chain, getting an implant in those calves while they're suckling usually pays really well.
And I think this year, as we look across the state, we have lots of variability in grass production, which we normally do. But this year, the eastern half of the state's a little bit drier than the western half of the state. Implants pay well when the calves have the resources available to capitalize on that efficiency. If they don't have the resources, that implant doesn't have as good of a payout. So making sure that they have the resources through the dam or through the grass is important to make sure you get a good return on that.
Yeah, exactly.
And then the only comment I was going to make was, depending if you had some outlet that in some different kind of branding or marketing program that didn't want those implants. So, yeah.
Absolutely. So I think that's a good opportunity for the cow-calf guys to implant those calves as they go through the summer. Email us comments, questions, anything you're thinking to bci@ksu.edu, and we look forward to visiting with you next week.
From the Beef Cattle Institute at Kansas State University, Brad White, Bob Larson, and Dustin Pendell. Hear the BCI Cattle Chat podcast in its entirety and or subscribe to that service at beefcattleinstitute.org. Beefcattleinstitute, all one word, .org. You're tuned to Agriculture Today.
Hamburgers, roast, ribs, steak, or whatever you prefer. Beef, it's what's for dinner. Kansas cattle farmers produce 7.5 million head of cattle per year. It takes about 7 tablespoons of peanut butter to get the same amount of protein in 1 serving of lean beef. Support your local Kansas farmers and ranchers. Eat beef. This message was brought to you by the K-State Animal Sciences Leadership Academy participants.
Agriculture Today continues now on the K-State Radio Network. Eric Atkinson with you as we turn to today's agricultural news page, and these headlines courtesy in part of DTN. Out of the USDA, the weekly Kansas Crop Progress and Condition Report for the week ending this past Sunday, our topsoil moisture supplies in the state at 3% surplus, 54% adequate, 43% still short to very short short, while subsoil moisture at 1% surplus and 55% adequate, 34% short to very short. The state of the corn crop in Kansas, well ahead of the game, 50% good to excellent as far as rating, 29% fair and 21% poor to very poor, but corn silking at 83%, that's well ahead of the 71% for the 5-year average, and corn in the dough stage is at 34%, again well ahead of the 14% average for the date. The condition of the Kansas soybean crop at 46% good to excellent, 36% fair, and 18% poor to very poor. Soybeans now blooming are at 74%, well ahead of the 47% average for the date, and soybeans setting pods at 30%. The average for the date is 11%. And the state of the grain sorghum crop in Kansas, 63% good to excellent, 31% fair, and 6% poor to very poor. Sorghum headed at 21%. That's ahead of the 11% average. Range and pasture conditions this week are at 28% good to excellent, 38% fair, and 34% poor to very poor. For the latest on the national ratings of corn and soybean production now, we turn to the USDA's Gary Crawford.
Cooler and wetter weather this past week in most of the Midwest.
And that at least held conditions steady, if not resulting in some slight improvement overall.
Agriculture Department meteorologist Brad Rippey says for corn,
we see the condition steady week over week at 72% good to excellent, 9% very poor to poor.
There are some states having problems with at least 20% of their corn rated poor to very poor, including Kansas, Missouri, Michigan, and Texas. Worst looking corn. North Carolina, 40% poor to very poor.
But that constitutes a small amount of the national acreage.
Meanwhile, soybeans, that crop looking a little better, 70% rated good to excellent, up 1% from a week ago. Both corn and bean development outpacing the 5-year average. 81% of the corn's in the silking stage, the average is 62. 44% of soybeans already setting pods. Normally, it's only 23% at this point. Gary Crawford for the U.S. Department of Agriculture, Washington.
White House Trade Advisor Peter Navarro told CNBC last Thursday that the damage from the trade war so far is no big deal. Quoting him, "We got two economies that add up to around $30 trillion in annual GDP. The amount of trade we're affecting with the tariffs is a rounding error compared to that," he said. Navarro's remarks drew a sharp rebuke from Senator Joni Ernst of Iowa, which we noted yesterday here in the broadcast, and the American Farm Bureau Federation has added their views, stating they have watched retaliatory tariffs hit U.S. agriculture especially hard. Quoting here the statement from the Farm Bureau, "Prices for all of our export-sensitive farm goods have tanked since May, when this tariff game started." The Farm Bureau statement went on to say the nation's farmers and ranchers support the broader goal of strengthening our overall economy and trade balance, but not at the risk of long-term irreparable harm to our agricultural exports and the jobs they create. And the Senate will name Farm Bill conferees today or tomorrow, setting the stage for the conference process to take another step. Senate Agriculture Committee Chairman Pat Roberts of Kansas said yesterday there will be 7 or more, likely 9, Senate conferees named. That would be far fewer than the 47 House conferees announced last week. The conference negotiations among the 4 principal negotiators will likely begin tomorrow. That would include the chairman and ranking Democrats on the Senate and House Agriculture Committees. Next up on Agriculture Today, the weekly feature for you dairy producers, milk lines. Here's K-State dairy specialist Mike Brook. Mike?
Today I want to visit with our Kansas dairy farmers concerning how heat stress might be affecting the members of their crew on their dairy farm. You know, we spend a lot of time thinking about how we're going to keep our cows cool and how we're going to help them handle the heat stress of summer, but how much time have we given to the other folks on our farm that make things happen every day? Here are some things that you might want to consider. Obviously, when it's this hot, hydration is very, very important for our crew as well as our animals. So how can we help our crew stay hydrated? Well, there's lots of interesting things we can do that really aren't all that expensive. Number one, just making sure that we have plenty of cold water available, whether we do that through coolers or bottled water. there's many different ways to accomplish that. We may have to accomplish it in different ways on different areas of the farm. Some other things that we can add are things like sports drinks or Gatorade. Again, when it's really, really hot, anything we can do to encourage our employees is a very positive thing to do on the dairy. So maybe you don't have these things available year-round, but as we look at the temperatures that we've been having lately and likely will have during some of the rest of the summer, providing some of this might be a very good way to motivate your employees. Some other things to think about are things like snacks. Sometimes just in the middle of the day, the opportunity to stop, just get a little something to eat, sometimes can keep us going when we're suffering from heat stress ourselves. So some things that you might think about, cold watermelon or cold fruit, middle of the day sometimes can go a long way to keeping people working and also motivated. Now, some other things to think about, what do you do over your lunch breaks? Are those lunch breaks for your employees? Is it in an air-conditioned area? Do they have the opportunity maybe to go home and have lunch and maybe take a little longer rest when it's very hot? Again, sometimes we need to adjust the work schedule. Maybe we start a little earlier in the day so we can take a little longer break over lunch, give our bodies a chance to recover a bit from the morning stress before we go back for afternoon stress. Now, some other things to think about, too, is that the family undergoes stress during this time as well. So, if you're in a community and you have families that really enjoy making use of the city pool or local pool passes can be a great way for the family to enjoy little bit of relief in the evenings, and it will also help us improve our relationship with employees by doing some of these things. Maybe even a pool party some evening could be a possibility for the farm crew, or at least most of the farm crew, keeping in mind somebody still probably has to keep the milking system going and those sorts of things, so accommodating everybody on a single evening may not be possible, but having a few evenings might be a way to do that. So this is Mike Brook with K-State Research and Extension, encouraging our dairy farmers to think about how they might help their employees with heat stress this summer.
While many people know hunger is an issue in developing countries, it is also a problem in our own backyards. In 2010, 1 in 7 Kansans struggled to put adequate food on the table. 2 K-State Research and Extension programs are tackling this problem. The Family Nutrition Program and Expanded Food and Nutrition Education Program reach thousands of Kansans in more than 70 counties. They learn how to eat healthy with a low budget. For more information about these programs, visit ksre.ksu.edu.
We're back now on Agriculture Today, and across the way once again is wildlife specialist, K-State Research and Extension, Charlie Lee. Charlie, a look today at products that would be considered raccoon repellents, and before we get into those and their performance, raccoons are the source of all kinds of nuisance activity, aren't they?
They're certainly one of the species that cause a lot of conflicts. We provide habitat that's very suitable for raccoons in suburban and urban areas. The rates of survival and reproduction in those suburban and urban areas are often higher than what is found in rural locations. And I think if you surveyed wildlife damage control operators around the country, that they would say raccoon calls are one of the more consistent and more numerous calls that they get. Oftentimes, the raccoon has invaded the living space. I've found raccoons to be fairly destructive. They have the ability, the strength, and tenacity to chew into an attic. Oftentimes, they get into openings that we've left for them. They simply enlarge them. If a raccoon's head would fit through the opening, they usually can get the rest of the body in, or they simply tear and chew and enlarge the opening until they can fit through. So oftentimes they're found in the attic of occupied dwellings, but sometimes they're also found in the chimney. And those situations are usually when the chimney was not capped at all or improperly capped, and the raccoon has found a suitable den site. Now, these problems more often occur during the late winter and early spring prior to raccoons having young, but they also occur throughout the year.
And evicting raccoons from, say, a chimney, pretty daunting challenge, isn't it?
Well, it can be a significant challenge. Professionals typically would use a special trapping system. Usually it mounts to the top of the chimney, or sometimes there are cage traps that drop down inside the chimney. Then they use some sort of a device to entice the female raccoon up into the trap. Oftentimes that's just a disturbance down at the fireplace opening. The female raccoon goes up into the cage trap at the top, and they simply physically reach in and remove the young raccoons. Now, that's not a task for most homeowners. There are times when you're dealing with raccoons on rooftops and tall chimneys that you want a professional to handle carrying a heavy trap up there on a steep roof high in the air. That's probably a challenge for a lot of homeowners. So oftentimes people are looking for ways to avoid those physical challenges of steep roofs and heavy cages and dealing with live animals in traps, and are looking for some sort of a repellent that would cause the raccoon to leave on their own. That would seem to be the best case scenario. The female raccoon leaves, maybe comes back and gets their young one at a time and moves them to a suitable place that perhaps is not somewhere where it causes conflicts with people.
That leads us to these raccoon eviction fluids as a type of repellent, to put it that way. What's the story behind these?
Well, a raccoon eviction fluid has been around since the mid-90s, and those fluids consist of glands and urine of male raccoons that is coupled with a preservative. That fluid is then put on like a tennis ball with a string tied to it, or a rag with a string tied to it, and drop down into the chimney. That odor is then strong enough to cause the female raccoon to exit. Oftentimes she will then come back and take her young with her, and then they find another place to live. The problem with raccoon eviction fluids is that they are not a registered product. They are not registered as a repellent. Now, since the primary component of those eviction fluids is urine or glands, that should be registered to be used as a repellent. Now, urine can be used and has some registration for repellents, but those are for rabbits. I'm not aware of any that are labeled for raccoons. So there could be some legal ramifications of using that product as a repellent. However, it is legal to use urines as an attractant. So in this case, you would be doing the opposite of attracting an animal to an area. You're trying to repel the animal. So in my opinion, when they're used in that way, they would be used as a repellent and thus would need to be registered. Keep in mind that there are many items that are used in wildlife damage control that are not registered. Sometimes those cause concerns, and sometimes there's little risk to using those products. One thing that comes to mind would be the use of coyote urine around flowers or gardens. It's commonly sold and used, and in that case, I would consider it a repellent. Again, it's probably not registered for that particular purpose. So keep in mind, if you're going to use these raccoon eviction fluids, that they're probably not registered for that purpose. Some of the research at looking at these products has found that they may not be that effective, but if it would be an easy, simple way to get a raccoon out of a chimney so that you had the opportunity to put the exclusion device, the chimney cap on to prevent future problems.
You hinted at this, and a recent research evaluation has illustrated that these fluids may not be the cure, if you will, for the problem.
Well, that one trial was a fairly small sample size. There were 15 uses of the two different products that they tested. One of the products was 50% effective. The other eviction fluid was not effective at all, so it got a 0% ranking. And water was 25% effective. So a very small sample size. It tells me that there's a lot of research that needs to be done on these products before we could consider them as a non-lethal repellent for raccoons.
The best option, and we always come back around to this, exclusion, keeping raccoons or other wildlife from entering your dwelling.
Keep in mind that we have to solve these types of problems with habitat modification, with exclusion or removal of the animals.
That's a bit of background on what are called raccoon eviction fluids, their performance, and moreover, just what you need to think about in keeping raccoons out of chimneys and attics and other places you don't want them. Charlie, we appreciate the word. Charlie Lee, wildlife specialist, K-State Research and Extension. Our time's away once again. Thanks for tuning in. Eric Atkinson for Agriculture Today. This is the K-State Radio Network.